艾玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。该作品被多次搬上荧幕。
Chapter 13 Secrets and Surprises. Early the next morning, Emma went to call on the Bateses. Old Mrs. Bates, who was alone in the small sitting-room, smiled when she saw Emma. "I am afraid that Jane is not very well," Mrs. Bates said. "She has a very bad headache. My daughter is looking after her." A few minutes later, Miss Bates came into the room. She looked unhappy. "I hear that Jane is not well," Emma said. "I am sorry." "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, you are so kind," said Miss Bates. "I suppose that you have heard our news. I should be pleased, but I am not. Poor Jane has been with us for such a long time. Mother and I will miss her so much. Jane has been writing letters to the Campbells and Mrs. Dixon. She had told them the news of her, you know, her new position. She will be a governess. But she has been crying, and now she has a bad headache. She really cannot see you." "I am surprised that Miss Fairfax has accepted a position so soon," Emma said. "I thought that she was waiting until Colonel Campbell and the Dixons returned from Ireland. Where is the position, Miss Bates? I hope that it is a good one." "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, you are always so kind," Miss Bates replied. "Jane is going to be a governess for Mrs. Smallridge. Her home is near Bristol. Jane will be looking after 3 little girls." And Mrs. Smallridge is a friend of Mrs. Elton's," Emma said. "Yes, she is. Mrs. Smallridge wanted Jane to go to Bristol 3 weeks ago. At first Jane said that she could not go so soon," Miss Bates replied. "We spent yesterday evening at Mrs. Elton's house. Just before tea, we heard that Mr. Frank Churchill had been called back to Richmond. Then after tea, poor dear Jane decided that she would go to Mrs. Smallridge at once. The news was quite a surprise to me. Quite a surprise. Oh, I see that you are looking at the piano, dear Miss Woodhouse. Well, it must stay there until Colonel Campbell comes back to England. It was his gift, or his daughter's, perhaps. I do not know. Poor Jane, she is so upset. Please excuse me, Miss Woodhouse. I must go back to her. I will give Jane your good wishes." When Emma got back to Hartfield, Mr. Knightley and Harriet were sitting with her father. Mr. Knightley stood up as Emma came into the room. "I am going to London, Emma," he said. "I have come to say goodbye before I go." "Emma has been calling on our dear friend, Miss Bates," Mr. Woodhouse said. "She went there after breakfast, as I told you." Emma looked up at Mr. Knightley and smiled at him. He understood why Emma had gone to the Bateses' house. He was pleased. Emma had made a bad mistake at Box Hill, but today she had behaved well and had shown good manners. Mr. Knightley took Emma's hand, held it, and smiled too. In another minute he had gone. Emma told her father what Jane had decided. Mr. Woodhouse was surprised and upset. He was very fond of Jane Fairfax. Emma and her father talked about the news all evening. But the next day brought even more surprising news. Mrs. Churchill was dead. No one had believed that the selfish old woman was ill. For the first time in 25 years, people found good things to say about her. Even Mr. Weston was sorry, but he was also thinking about his son. Mrs. Churchill's funeral was going to take place in Yorkshire. Emma thought about Frank too. "Frank can make his own decisions about his future life now," she said to herself. "If he wanted to marry Harriet, it would not be a problem now." Then Emma remembered that Jane Fairfax would soon be leaving Highbury. Emma was sorry that they had not been good friends, and she invited Jane to spend a day at Hartfield. But Jane was ill. She was too ill to visit or even to write. She had bad headaches and could not eat. Dr. Perry was very worried about Jane. He said that Jane was too ill to leave Highbury. He wanted her to rest. The doctor told Miss Bates that Jane's health would be in danger if she went to work for Mrs. Smallridge. Emma wrote to Jane again. She offered Jane a ride in the Woodhouses' carriage. Jane sent an answer to Hartfield. She was too ill to go out, and she refused Emma's offer. But later that day, someone saw Jane walking in the fields near Highbury. Then Emma understood that Jane did not want to see her, and she was sorry. About 10 days after Mrs. Churchill's death, Mr. Weston called at Hartfield to see Emma. "Please come to Randalls as soon as you can, Emma," he said. "Mrs. Weston has something very important to tell you." Emma was worried. "Mr. Weston, why cannot you tell me now?" she asked. "No, I promised Mrs. Weston that I would not tell you," Mr. Weston replied. "Come back to Randalls with me now, but do not say anything that will worry your father." Emma told Mr. Woodhouse that she was going for a walk, and she hurried out with Mr. Weston. "Have you heard from Frank?" Emma asked as they walked away from Hartfield. "Frank was at Randalls this morning, but he has gone again," Mr. Weston replied. Emma was very surprised, but Mr. Weston said nothing more. They were soon at Randalls. Mr. Weston left Emma with Mrs. Weston, who was looking ill and unhappy. "What is the trouble, my dear friend?" Emma asked her quickly. "Please tell me at once. Has your news anything to do with Mr. Frank Churchill?" "Yes, it has," Mrs. Weston replied. "Frank spoke to his father about an attachment this morning. Frank is engaged to a young lady. He has promised to marry her." Emma was silent. "Oh, Emma," Mrs. Weston cried. "Frank Churchill and Miss Fairfax are engaged to be married. I cannot believe it. They have been engaged for 8 months. They met in Weymouth, and they have been engaged since October. They have kept their engagement a secret from everyone." Emma did not know what to say. "I cannot believe it either. It is very strange," she said. "Mr. Weston and I are both very upset," Mrs. Weston went on. "We think that Frank has behaved very badly." She smiled sadly and held Emma's hand. "I understand why you spoke to me alone here," Emma said quietly. "But do not worry about me. I do not love Mr. Frank Churchill. I used to have feelings for him, but he has been no more than a friend for the last 2 months. Mrs. Weston looked a little happier. "I am very pleased to hear that, my dear Emma. "I am very pleased," she said. "At one time, our dearest wish was that you and Frank would love each other. But he was in love with Jane when he came to Highbury." "Frank may love Jane, but he has behaved very badly," Emma said. "Frank was not honest with me, and he was not honest with Jane either." "Jane watched how Frank behaved in Highbury," Mrs. Weston said. "She was sad and upset that their engagement was a secret. They quarrelled. Jane accepted the position with Mrs. Smallridge, and she did not tell Frank. As soon as Frank heard of Jane's plan to be a governess, he told his uncle, Mr. Churchill, about the engagement. Then Frank rode back to Highbury and found that poor Jane was very ill. They both knew that there must be no more secrets. After that, Frank rode on to Randalls and told us everything." "Frank Churchill is a very lucky man," Emma said with a smile. "Because Jane Fairfax loves Frank Churchill, she did not tell her friends the truth about her relationship with him. Frank asked her not to speak about it, and she has been true to him. Her character is very good, and I wish her every happiness." Mr. Weston heard these words as he came into the room. He smiled as he held Emma's hand in his own. "I congratulate you, Mr. Weston," Emma said, giving him her best wishes. "You will soon have a daughter-in-law who is one of the best and one of the most beautiful young ladies in England." When she was back at Hartfield, Emma began to think about Harriet. Poor Harriet! She must now be told of Frank Churchill's engagement to Jane Fairfax. "And I shall have to tell Harriet the news myself," Emma thought. "I have been very wrong. Because of me, Harriet believed that she could be Frank Churchill's wife. I gave her hope. I have been very foolish indeed." Harriet came to Hartfield later that day. She ran into the sitting-room to speak to Emma. "Have you heard the news, Miss Woodhouse?" she cried. "What news?" Emma asked, but she knew what Harriet was going to say. "The news about Jane Fairfax and Mr. Frank Churchill, of course," Harriet cried. "They are to be married. Did you know that they were in love, Miss Woodhouse? I did not." "I did not know, Harriet. If I had known, I would have told you. I never wanted you to be unhappy," Emma replied. "I am not unhappy," Harriet said with a laugh. "Did you think that I wanted to be Mrs. Frank Churchill? What a strange mistake. The man that I have feelings for is far, far better than Mr. Churchill. This man is a true gentleman in every way." "Harriet," Emma said carefully, "we must understand each other. Are you speaking about Mr. Knightley?" "Of course," Harriet replied. "We have talked about him a lot. I thought that you understood what I was saying." "But, Harriet," said Emma, "the gentleman whom you liked helped you. That is what you said. It was Mr. Frank Churchill who saved you from the gypsies. I thought that you were talking about him." Harriet laughed and shook her head. "Mr. Knightley danced with me at the ball, when I did not have a dancing partner," Harriet said. "You remember that Mr. Elton would not dance with me. Mr. Knightley helped me that evening. He saved me. That was my meaning. Mr. Knightley was very kind to me. He is the kindest man that I know. He is a gentleman in every way. I do hope that you will be happy for me, Miss Woodhouse, and for Mr. Knightley too, of course." "Good God!" cried Emma. "This is a terrible mistake. What can I do?" "You do not have to do anything, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said with a happy smile. I know that Mr. Knightley is a gentleman of society and that I have no money. But if he does not care about that, why should I? I hope that you will be happy for us both." Emma was silent. Then she spoke very quietly. "Do you think that Mr. Knightley feels the same way about you, Harriet?" Emma asked. "Oh, yes, Miss Woodhouse. I am pleased to say that I do think that," Harriet replied. Emma could not believe it. She tried to understand her own feelings. Why did the news about Harriet and Mr. Knightley make her feel so unhappy? And then at last she knew the truth. Mr. Knightley must marry Emma herself. Emma had to listen to Harriet praising Mr. Knightley and explaining her feelings for him. "He was so kind to me at Donwell Abbey," Harriet said. "He paid a lot of attention to me. He walked with me and no one else. He asked me then if I had feelings for anyone. I did not answer, but I understood him at once." "Perhaps Mr. Knightley was talking about Mr. Martin," Emma said. "Oh, no, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet replied. "Mr. Knightley said nothing about Mr. Martin. You taught me not to care for Mr. Martin. No, Mr. Knightley was talking about himself. I know that he has feelings for me. I am very happy." At that moment, Emma and Harriet heard Mr. Woodhouse coming towards them. "I must go, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said quickly. "I shall tell your father my news some other time." Emma was very pleased that Harriet had left her alone. A few seconds later she ran quickly upstairs to her own room. "Oh, God, I wish that I had never met Harriet Smith," Emma cried. Emma tried to understand her own feelings. She knew that she was very unhappy. She had made herself unhappy. She knew now that she had never loved Mr. Frank Churchill. He had flattered her and made her laugh, but that was all. Mr. Knightley had been Emma's friend all her life. He was a far better gentleman than any other man that she had ever known. All her life Emma had respected Mr. Knightley. Now she knew that she loved him too, but it was too late. "And I have spoilt Harriet," Emma said to herself. "Harriet is a kind, simple girl. She could have been happy with Robert Martin, but I told her that she could marry a gentleman. I made Harriet think that Mr. Elton was in love with her. I was wrong. I invited Harriet to Hartfield, where she saw Mr. Knightley nearly every day. I praised her and flattered her. Harriet believes that a gentleman like Mr. Knightley could love her because of me. How I wish that Harriet and Mr. Knightley had never met. I shall never be happy again."